Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle. My name is Alan Hyde, and tonight we're joined by a familiar guest. He was on the show in late December with his wife, Beth. Luke Snear, licensed professional counselor. Welcome back, sir.
Good to be back.
Tonight we're going to talk about OCD. It's a topic we've talked about on this show before. We're going to dive into some pretty heavy topics. I read the article that you sent over, and we'll preface this with you guys, but the article had to do with some compulsions and obsessions around traditionally what society would call pedophilia. We'll talk about all things OCD, and it'll be interesting to get into that article as well. But why don't we just start there? Obsessive compulsive disorder. How would you define it and describe it for those who maybe haven't heard of it or are tuning in for the first time?
OCD is an interesting thing. It's an interesting diagnosis, and it's an interesting thing in our society because we see stuff on TV shows like Monk and other movies and stuff where somebody has OCD, and it's almost always like a germophobia thing, right?
Yeah.
But really, OCD can look like almost anything. OCD will attack whatever is most important to a person's life. And so it's always a thing that's ego dystonic. It's a thing that goes against our values, which we'll touch on a lot when we get into the POCD stuff.
Yeah.
Because stuff like that can feel very scary when OCD comes up. And in a classic definition, I guess to answer your question specifically, the DSM classifies OCD as the presence of any obsession and associated compulsions that alleviate that obsessive anxiety, and then those compulsions are distressing to not do.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the DSM.
Yeah, which then is important, right? Especially in today's day and age, as you and I would talk offline, or any therapist would have, like, get in the rooms with a professional. There are time frames on these things. There are severities that we want to pay attention to. If you guys are sitting there hearing that definition and then diagnosing yourself, right? It's like let's slow down a little bit. But absolutely, that's how I've always heard it described as well.
Yeah.
I like how when you were saying ego dystonic, you added in the description. I didn't even have to ask you. That's good, because as we go, we're going to be talking about a lot of really heavy terms, right?
Yeah.
That have a lot of definition and weight behind them. And like last time, we'll just define them as we go.
For sure.
Yeah. So what got you working with OCD? What brought you in that direction?
A story that I tell all the time. It was my older sister. So we're both adopted. She's 11 months older than I am. And from a pretty young age, she struggled with fairly severe OCD that shifted and took on many different forms at different times, but a lot of religious scrupulosity and a lot of contamination OCD. And religious scrupulosity is another one that tends to go under-recognized in the OCD world, and that is scrupulous as in being too scrupulous towards usually a religious code. Sometimes it can just be a kind of agnostic moral code as well, but it's this obsessive worry that I may have done something wrong morally or religiously, or God hates me, or I'll definitely go to hell, and that's the obsessive thought that can get stuck.
Yeah.
And so growing up, watching somebody struggle with that, it definitely made it very personal to me. And as I got into more OCD specialized training, the more I fell in love with it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that experience working with OCD, that
Yeah.
they find it really fulfilling, because it is, like we were talking before, how a lot of people, they'll come in for talk therapy. If they have OCD, it can entrench them. It can make the OCD worse.
Yeah.
Well, I've always seen and found from those who do work with it is when you find the right treatment for it, the work can happen pretty quickly. You can see some measurable growth pretty quickly.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. What I mean, other than just finding the right mode of treatment, what do you think it is about some of the interventions that are used for OCD that are so effective?
I mean, the gold standard treatment, anybody will tell you, is ERP, exposure response prevention therapy. And ERP is fascinating because it flies in the face of a lot of traditional talk therapy modalities. Like, it's the most normal thing in the world to walk into a therapist's office and go, hey, I'm really stuck with this thought. I don't know, had a kid 6 months ago, and I keep having this intrusive thought that I want to drop them. Like, I'll just drop them and hurt my baby, and I'm kind of freaking out about that. And of course, as a talk therapist, we would, okay, well, let's really get into that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about why or why not, and do the CBT thing and really explore that and look for evidence. And what all of that does is just help that person find new and exciting compulsions to do to try and prove myself wrong. And it's interesting that typically in a session like that, the client may feel better in that moment. And then they walk out and pretty quickly those compulsions stop working, because they always do, and OCD grows. Instead, ERP does exactly the opposite. And in a way that can feel kind of bizarre sometimes, you'll sit in front of an ERP therapist and talk about that uncertainty of maybe you do want to drop your baby on the floor. What would that be like? What would happen if you sat with that idea and didn't have to change it and did a whole lot of radical acceptance about it, and then sit with that? And isn't that kind of an insane thing?
It's a little bit, yeah. You know, I was holding a friend's baby. This was years ago. It was when I was working at the Amen Clinic, so we had an office. It was on the 5th floor of this office building, and I'm holding this like newborn baby, and the thought in my head was like, oh, what if I trip and the baby goes flying off the 5th floor? You know, because we're out on this balcony, and the only thing you really can do with it, I think, what's interesting, when I was reading the article that you had sent over too, that story is what came to mind, and I was thinking, there's only really one way through that, and that's to accept that you've had this thought. It's really dark, you know, but you didn't do it. Right? And you're not gonna do it.
And I steal a story from an early mentor of mine, Dr. Charles Brady, who always uses the train example for something like that. Most of us have stood in front of a train or a subway, and you see it coming along, and your brain does that intrusive little thing where it goes, hey, you could jump. Like, you could jump in front of it. And for most of us, in an oversimplified way, that kind of hits us in that prefrontal cortex, and the logical part of our brain, where we go, that was an interesting thought. And it can still bring us some distress based on the meaning that we assign to that, et cetera, et cetera. But in some way, what we could call a neurotypical brain sees that logically. A person with OCD, and this is one of the hallmarks of OCD, experiences that obsessive thought with the same emotional intensity as if it was actually occurring. And that's a thing that can be hard for us to wrap our minds around without having that experience. But we can imagine what it would be like to actively be falling in front of that train. That's what it's like to have the thought for a person that experiences OCD. And so having a thought and an emotional expression that powerful, why would you do anything other than take a step back from that train? And by taking that compulsive step back, people with OCD experience the anxiety coming down quite profoundly. It really works that anxiety came down quickly. And then, of course, the next day you go to the train station, you have this obsessive thought, and your brain knows, I know exactly how to handle this, and I take one step back. But over time, one step becomes 2 steps, becomes 5 steps, becomes I'm not even going to wait at the platform. I'm going to see that train come up, and then I'll run and go get on the train really fast. But then that's a lot of work, and I'm showing up to work sweaty, and so now I can't even get on the train anymore. Now the thought of seeing a train in the distance makes me think that maybe I wouldn't be careful enough around trains. And so now I don't even want to think about or talk about trains. So doing ERP with this person might be just an imaginative, let's talk about trains. Let's complete some of these thoughts that pop up as flash images in your brain and practice sitting with those. It's an incredibly effective place to start.
And I know ERP eventually, with some therapists, right, can be going to certain places with certain interventions. Not always, which I think is it's a fascinating part of the discussion that unfolds for me as I sit down with professionals around OCD, because as a professional, you know, some people, like you were saying, they'll hear OCD and they just think of like the germaphobes and these kind of things. As a professional, I hear OCD and I think just like, you know, you're taking them through the interventions, like physically getting them out there, but there's so much more in between before you're ever there.
For sure.
And are you with your virtual work, are you focusing more on the cases where it's not out in person doing those kind of like, let's go to the train station type interventions?
Oh no, those are my favorite interventions.
Okay.
And because we're virtual and because cell phones are what they are today, you can take me with you.
Oh, interesting.
I love doing ERP from your shopping cart. And I'll turn my video off so it looks like you're just on the phone. But yeah, you go do whatever the exposure is, especially if it's a kind of a social anxiety type exposure. Yeah, let's go to the mall. Go talk to random people and ask them random questions, and I'll be right here in your AirPods. And that's pretty cool.
That is cool. What are some of, we don't have to out anybody that you work with, but what are some of the examples of what they're asking you to help with in those scenarios?
And I've been thinking about this kind of question because, all right, let me try to come up with something that's totally fake and not anybody real. And in some way, I would reference an example was a training video that we have. Dr. Nick and Dr. Me are some fantastic psychologists through NoCD that put together a hilarious training video of Dr. Nick playing the client going through a mall. And quite literally, the exposure there would be, hey, go find somebody in this Barnes & Noble and just ask them where to find something. And then from the patient's side, it's like, okay, let me gear up to do this thing. I'm going to be super anxious. And let's do a lot of work in the response prevention of you're going to be anxious and you're not going to do anything to make that anxiety feel better, which may include don't say sorry after you ask this person something.
Yeah.
Oftentimes that's the obsessive worry is that I'm going to inconvenience somebody by my presence, basically.
Yeah.
And no, you have to unapologetically do that, be present, feel the anxiety, don't change it.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, that's a common compulsion, apologizing for breathing.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. I have to, with the family members of alcoholics, right? That's a common compulsion and behavior is stop apologizing for breathing.
Yeah.
Right? We have to be able to communicate who we are, why we're here, what we need, And I can imagine with things like OCD, those behaviors and the shame involved, right? And the self-criticism, that approaching somebody without saying sorry could be a very difficult task.
Yeah, absolutely. And shame plays such a central role in many people's expression of OCD. It's a thing that absolutely gets in the way.
Yeah. Well, society has so many opinions, and then when you're talking about something like OCD, and I'm sure you would agree on this because of just the premise of how we're discussing it today, it's like society has already decided what the definitions are, who's in the club, who's not.
Yeah.
Often it's wrong. And so there's all of that with somebody who may genuinely have a struggle, That's what I always find with a lot of like the mental health clubs that exist on the internet.
Yeah.
It's like the ones who are in it, maybe they have it, maybe they don't. But the ones who do have it, they're not in those clubs. They don't want to be in those clubs.
Yep.
They're ashamed to be in those clubs.
Yep. One of our chief clinical officer at NoCD is Dr. McGrath, and he tells the great story of the problem with OCD in the media is that people are always open about their OCD. When we see them on TV, they always talk about, oh, this is my OCD, I have this thing with my OCD. And that is the biggest thing that flies in the face of reality. Because in reality, anybody experiencing OCD is very quiet about it.
Yeah.
They very much want to hide all of their obsessions and compulsions because it's a thing that can feel shameful, especially depending on what kind of subtype of OCD they're struggling with.
Yeah. Well, which was the article that you had shared.
Which brings us to POCD.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, one we've never had on this show. When I was just kind of testing the waters and sharing it around that was going to be the discussion, everybody came back with a very similar response, which was, that'll be very interesting, right? Because it doesn't get talked about a lot. And I was talking with someone else about, we'll get into this in just a minute, but POCD is pedophilia, obsession compulsion disorder.
Yep.
Someone was like, well, what if that's just sex addiction? It's like, okay, well, I gave this example and see if you would think. I said, let's say an active drug dealer walks into NA, all right? That would probably be very similar to like an active pedophile walking into SAA, right?
Sure.
These are illegal behaviors. If we're to help you, you need to stop,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
But all of that aside, these were some of the side discussions as I was just kind of testing the waters this week. But let's get into what it is and how others may relate to it.
Sure.
Because it's a heavy topic.
Yeah, and it's a topic that I absolutely want to bring more awareness to because it's kind of heavy to talk about. We don't talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
Some of the early exposures in working with somebody with POCD is by bringing out the word pedophile to begin with, because that's one of those thoughts that they really struggle to even complete. I just have this worry that maybe I've harmed a child, maybe I've harmed my child, and that's a hard thing to put a label on.
Yeah.
And sitting with this uncertainty of maybe I'm a pedophile is a dark thing.
Yeah.
It's a hard sentence to say.
Well, it makes me think about like when I'm working with addicts or even in my own personal therapy, when my therapist held up the word entitlement, I'm like, I'm not entitled, right? It's like it stung, you know? But it's like the truth of the matter is that I was entitled, and any other person I've ever worked with in 12-step recovery is entitled, and we have to be able to put the proper names to things.
Sure.
But it can sting, especially when the term isn't a definition, right? That was what was interesting about reading the article too, is like that fine line between the questions around compulsive thoughts, and, you know, kind of the obsession as to whether or not that's ever actually really a thing for that person. That's what I found fascinating with POCD.
And with POCD, and this bears repeating a million times, a person that is experiencing pedophilic OCD has never harmed a child, not once, because it's a highly ego dystonic thing. It typically strikes people who have maybe had some OCD in their life, and then they have kids.
Yeah.
And then this kid is now the most important thing in my life. And so what does OCD do? What does OCD do? It attacks it.
Yeah.
That becomes the new obsession. And then everything that I do becomes filled with doubt. When I changed that diaper, did I like it? Maybe I should check my body to see if I have a reaction to this. And then that becomes the compulsion. And so harming a child or not harming a child is never the compulsion.
Right.
Or never the obsession. It's the worry that I may have.
Yeah.
It's the worry that I may want to. And that is never a thing that is an actual danger to children.
Yeah.
It's only a thing that causes suffering in the person experiencing it.
Yeah, right. And then further perpetuated by never being able to talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is, for OCD, without being too hyperbolic, that's a death sentence for your mental health.
For sure. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it, is because there's not a lot of male therapists to begin with.
Yeah.
And then in the OCD space, somebody that is experiencing POCD probably doesn't want to talk about it with a female practitioner.
Yeah.
And so they come and talk to me.
It's a solid point. There's there's a lot of topics like that I'm sure you've seen too in the years that you've done it, where when I was working in treatment centers, a guy doesn't want to open up about a certain thing. He wants the female therapist, which is always a game, right?
Yep.
But then when he would land on my caseload, he may be third, fourth time around through the treatment process, but this time he's opening up. It's like, well, yeah, go figure. You know, not only are a lot of people that are heterosexual distracted by their female therapist,
Sure.
But there are a lot of topics that they're ashamed to talk about, especially the sex addicts I've worked with. But I would imagine with OCD around pedophilic thoughts, that would be almost not impossible, but it'd be a huge barrier in the beginning to get to.
Well, can you only imagine what you would think a first session would be like with somebody if you sat down and said, here's what I'm really struggling with. I can't be around kids because I'm worried that I'll have a physical reaction and that I might like watching kids at a playground. And then, of course, there's 1,000 responses that your brain can come up with,
Right.
that a therapist might judge that, even inadvertently. I've absolutely had conversations about POCD with other clinicians that go, oh, well, those people need to be locked up until we can help them. No, 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 not at all. These are, in fact, the safest people in the world around kids because they're so worried about it.
Yeah. Well, I feel like obviously, as you and I talk about it, and we have access to the articles, we're reading through them, we understand them. I also know how TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, all these places work, which is why it's like, hey, do your worst, like it or hate it, just engage with it, right?
Yeah.
But it's worth reiterating what Luke is really getting at is that there are pedophiles, and then there are those with OCD, with those fears and concerns that they would maybe be like that, which is the very barrier as to why they will never be like that. And that's, I think, another very solid picture for OCD in general, right? The fear is, I'm going to jump in front of the train. That motherfucker is never going to jump in front of a train. It's not going to happen. They're terrified of trains.
Yeah.
They're going to be at home under their bed.
Won't even be near a train.
Yeah.
For sure.
Which, the point you were highlighting is like, it attacks the thing people care about the most. Well, now we're talking about generational traumas, family dissension, ties breaking in families because this thing that you love more than anything, now you can't even interact with it. And that, I would imagine, affects a lot of families around the country.
For sure. And that is the kind of evil paradox of OCD, that I'm so worried about harm potentially coming to my kids that I can't interact with my kids. Yeah. I'm so driven to be a good parent that it's actually affecting my parenting. And that's a hard thing to deal with. And so because of that, the exposures that we do are always socially normative. It's go hang out with your nieces and nephews and avoid the sneaky safety behaviors that you've been doing, such as always make sure that there's another person in the room with you. Always make sure that you're filming at all times so that if there's ever a question about what happened, I've got it on film right here.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting the rabbit hole of behaviors that could exist around that too, but just helping people find safety in that, you know?
Yeah.
And not question themselves or think that they're crazy. I think when you had suggested the topic, I was like, well, that'll be interesting because we're all about breaking down those destructive patterns. It's one I don't know a ton about, but I imagine there are a lot of people out there where the thought has popped into their head.
Sure.
You know, of course it has. I mean, it's like, I kind of sit here from the standpoint as I was reading the article that you sent over too, of like, who hasn't had a thought pop into their head about like, am I safe around this kid?
Yeah.
Unless you've just never been around kids.
For sure. Yeah. And my entire career has existed in female-dominated fields.
Right.
I was a gymnastics coach before I ever got into therapy and all of that. So there are reasonable precautions that men in our field should take. And you also have to manage when that becomes truly obsessive. Yeah. Because like we hit on earlier, of course, you and I have had this thought before. It's that little intrusive thought that can go to that prefrontal cortex and we kind of logically go, oh, that was kind of yucky. I didn't like that, moving on. Yeah. Versus somebody that experiences OCD, that would go straight to the amygdala and light that thing up like a campfire. And they would have the experience of, what if I actually did that? And then, of course, how do you not do a compulsion about that? Yeah. That's an extremely hard thing to sit with. Yeah.
And then breaking it down over time, not just for that person, but for their family.
Yeah.
I guess that's why they call it family therapy, but like you and I know, that mode of intervention is hard to get to.
Absolutely it is.
Does No OCD, the organization that you're currently working with, do they treat it like for family systems as well and work with families?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. obviously more so with our child and adolescent population.
Right.
That's where it's predominantly a family-based intervention. But there's very few specific subtypes of OCD where some type of family work wouldn't be helpful.
Right.
I phrase that in a weird way. It's often helpful to do family therapy, regardless of what the subtype is.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot, OCD has a lot of parallels with addiction, especially from the standpoint of, if you're not using the right modalities, you could be causing harm.
Yeah.
A big one, I always put it like this, is like an alcoholic comes into the office and somebody who isn't trained in working with alcoholics I guess I would say it like this: the best mode for working with an alcoholic is to test their willingness to go to a 12-step meeting. If the answer is no, then the odds are you're sitting with someone who has either drank recently or is going to drink as soon as they leave your office. And in that case, talk therapy is going to do nothing.
Yeah.
And it really is, I would say, with the alcoholic, a true alcoholic, it is that black and white.
I believe it.
Yeah, and with OCD, there's a similar surety to the compulsions, right? It's like without really understanding the confrontation that is needed for the obsession or the compulsion, you can be sure they either just were engaging in it or are going to when they leave your office.
Sure. And there is probably a good example that would be a little bit of a, we'll say, combines several people that I have interacted with in this kind of mode, that there are people that are fully debilitated by their OCD, and specifically with compulsions that take up their entire day. And that could be specifically tapping the right way, even doing the correct eye movements and body movements and counting the right things and breathing the right way. And all of these things can leave a person absolutely bedridden. And when you have this conversation with them about, hey, we need to decrease your compulsions to help you with this, they go, well, why would I, when I know my emotional experience tells me if I don't do these compulsions, then a cataclysm is going to come. And what cataclysm? I don't know. I don't even know. It could be a tsunami or a hurricane or a tornado, but everybody I know is going to die unless I do this compulsion.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to shake somebody out of.
Yeah.
Especially an adolescent.
Right.
And in some way, you do a little bit of the CBT of talking around. At some point, you have to do an experiment with that. You have to take a little bit of a leap of faith because, and arguably, you are suffering now. All of these compulsions serve to alleviate this future suffering, but you've been bedridden for months, potentially.
Right.
So you're actively suffering already.
Yeah.
And getting somebody to that place of readiness, it definitely isn't an impossible thing.
Yeah, certainly not impossible. OCD is very treatable. I guess that's kind of the PSA in the middle of the show here, is that OCD is very treatable.
Absolutely.
It's also very serious, which I think also begs an important question of your take and your thoughts on, medication management and compliance.
Huge.
Huge. I
Huge.
figured as much, but let's kind of tie in some of those. Do you feel OCD benefits from like short-term medication compliance, long-term? I know like with bipolar, we're looking at long-term medication compliance. What would you say that it kind of leans more towards like the anxiety sphere of things, where you can be relatively successful with a short-term compliance in those realms with therapy?
Yes. Okay. And as always, my disclaimer that I'm not a psychiatrist, but here's what I've experienced in the field. Yes, SSRIs are the frontline medication for OCD, and they absolutely work. As in most modalities and most, anxiety, depression, doing therapy and doing medication has a compounding effect, and it's even better. The fascinating thing with SSRIs, a person with OCD typically needs more. And I say typically and really mean almost always. For somebody that would be on a typical therapeutic dose of Zoloft, for example, a therapeutic dose for anxiety and depression may be 20 milligrams. A therapeutic dose for OCD may be 40 or 60, and that's reaching the top of what is FDA approved. And that's a thing that not a lot of psychiatrists are necessarily trained on. And it's a thing that
I would imagine are willing to do.
Exactly. It's a thing that goes on the outer bounds of what is typical to come through their office. So a part of people's story with OCD tends to be a 10 to 15 year period of seeking services, not getting a therapist that's trained in ERP. So therapy isn't really hitting. And then they typically bounce between every SSRI they can get their hands on, never once hitting an actual therapeutic dose for OCD. Because that's kind of how psychiatry works. The art and the science of it is to try a thing, and if it doesn't work, well, probably let's not do that harder. Let's switch it and try something else. But for OCD, you typically need more of it. And it's definitely effective in the short term, as effective as any SSRI can be in the short term. And it's effective in the long term, with the caveat that we typically see that good SSRI long-term effect once you've been on it for like a year or so, depending on the med. And so, yeah, they're super helpful. SSRIs are amazing. And the counterpoint to that is that benzos are bad for OCD. They're good in the short term, but ultimately it can serve very similarly to a compulsion. People that are on benzodiazepines to manage their anxieties are actually, in many ways, immune to ERP therapy because that anxiety center, something in their amygdala, isn't able to fire in a way that we can kind of build upon in ERP and doing exposures.
Sure. Yeah, I would imagine it looks something like, I felt fine.
Sure.
Yeah. And they might not have felt fine without the benzo.
Yeah. Or fascinatingly, I'm still freaking out in this exposure. But then as soon as we exit this exposure, it's kind of a built-in safety behavior. My brain's going to calm down. And instead, for ERP to be effective, oftentimes we need you to feel a little bit anxious for a long time to feel that slowly come down.
Yeah, well, that's the benefit of any type of exposure. It's like we had a gentleman on last week, and he was talking about it in the sense of grief and loss, that he had lost his mother, and it hit him way later. He was walking here in Fort Worth. He was walking across the street in the city, and he just felt this pain, like emotional pain. That you know when you feel something so profoundly emotional that it's physical, like whether it's hot tears or the pits in your stomach. And he was talking about this, and he said, and then it just expanded. And he said the realization afterwards was, in that expanse, he expanded to be able to handle the pain. As I'm listening to you, that's that process of exposure.
Absolutely.
Right? You're expanding into this pain in these new places of awareness that you can stand where everybody else is standing, waiting for the train.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a metaphor that I use in almost every single, like, session one. Let's talk about what ERP is. And what ERP is growing your ability to sit with uncertainty. Because, in a way, uncertainty is the cure for OCD. Almost all compulsions serve to find a feeling of certainty. Whether that's definitely yes or definitely no, at least it's definitely. And sitting in uncertainty is the goal of ERP. And that's not a thing that you can just do for free. That's a skill that you have to build. And a lot of people naturally ask the question, well, am I going to feel this anxious forever? Well, yes and no, because in a similar metaphor, what we're doing is practicing swimming. So long as you are managing your anxiety with compulsions, you're hanging on to the edge of the pool. And I can't teach you to swim if you're hanging on to the edge of the pool.
Right.
And by the time we're done with this, you're going to know how to swim. And so will you never be anxious again? No. Will you never be wet again? No. But you'll know how to swim in the water. And that's a metaphor that oftentimes clicks for people. And they go, okay, I can get that. And there's some validity in throwing you into the deep end right away will never be helpful to you.
Yeah.
And I would definitely never judge your inability to swim in the deep end if you don't know how to swim.
That's a lot of scenarios in life, right?
Yeah.
It's steer clear of the person who judges you when you tripped and fell into the deep end and was laughing at you because you needed help out. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you had never been in there, and they don't know you well enough to know you can't swim in that deep end.
Yeah.
You know, and you steer clear of those situations. You'll find peace in life when you surround yourself with people who know that you're trying and know how you're trying. There's some beauty in that in life.
Yeah.
You know, and some anxiety reduction in that as well.
For sure.
When you're around the right people, especially those who can teach you how to swim.
Yeah.
But as you're learning to swim, and this is maybe we could have a little fun with this, where do you think some of these things start as these little tykes are learning how to swim? Where is OCD coming from? You think it's a brain wiring issue early on? Do you think it's a behavioral trauma? Do you think it's a family dynamic issue? I'm not looking for any one. None of us are looking for any specific answer, but let's just have fun.
Good, because you probably can't have one.
I imagine not.
And in a general sense, the diathesis model of stress definitely applies, where you have to have some genetic predisposition, of course, and then some stressful activating event that produces the expression of OCD. OCD is absolutely genetic. We don't know what that gene necessarily is, but it's definitely genetic. We can track that through families. If you have OCD, one or both of your parents probably does too. Mm-hmm. As far as let's go this direction. People with OCD often have years of remission, and they can go through periods of, I haven't even been thinking about it, and then something will happen. Something kicks it off again. And the thing that restarts that cycle truly is compulsing. Mm-hmm. So long-term recovery from OCD absolutely will look like later in life at some point you're going to have an obsessive thought, because none of us are free of our intrusive thoughts. But when it comes, you're going to know how to swim in that deep water, and you're going to know, I have to avoid compulsing about this, and I have to sit in this moment. And when you do that for the first time and you never grow it and you never give it that power, it can typically be a thing that you sit through once and then are able to move on from.
Yeah.
And then it never grows.
You know what just hit me like a ton of bricks? And I've thought about this before, but as you were giving that picture, is I've never met an addict ever that I've treated that does not have this symptom base.
Yep.
All right. I've thought about it before. Obviously, I work with it day in and day out. I take this different route, right, with addictions that ultimately comes right back around to this other side of, if they weren't abusing a substance, they probably have OCD, you know?
Yeah.
And a lot of times the overlap in those diagnoses are pretty heavy anyway. But as you were describing it, I was like, yeah, you just described an addict, right? I mean, you're going to have to admit powerlessness daily because we can't avoid our intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, and for the addict, it's like you go to the grocery store and alcohol is the first thing on your left when you walk in the store. It's right there.
Yep.
You know, one day is going to come where your brain goes, huh, and you got to know how to swim.
Yeah. And what if I don't know how to swim and the only thing that I know how to do is my compulsion, whether that's an OCD thing or to go start drinking.
Yeah. And I think that's why, you know, people can make a big stink about like mental health and therapy and therapeutic interventions.
Yeah.
And you see it a lot, obviously, in media where it gets picked at. But that point you just made of a human being, a fully grown adult, doing the same thing over and over and over again, until they learn another way, they're going to do the same thing.
Absolutely.
And that's a large part of what therapy is trained professionals who know when to slide in something, right, that you don't know yet, and to see, are you ready to pick this one up yet or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was listening to a comedian where he was talking about going to Sam's Cut. So, right, Sam's Cut, is that the one. Yeah. And he is like, every time I just make the same mistake. So I'll get out into the parking lot after and just look in the mirror and think, fuck. Yeah. But then I go back to the same, place to get my hair cut. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, we've got to change that.
It's hard to break patterns.
Yeah.
It absolutely is.
Yeah. And sometimes talking through it doesn't always do that, but acting through it, and that's another huge part of any type of recovery.
For sure.
Your actions are going to dictate how well you do.
Yeah. And just a little bit of psychoeducation and a whole lot of self-reflection goes a really long way.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. That's one of the cool things about OCD. We always open with just a whole bunch of psychoeducation. Like, here's this thing that you haven't really understood other than I feel miserable and this makes me feel better. And then it makes me feel miserable again later. That's a very confusing place to be.
Yeah.
And so getting labels in that, and we use multiple diagrams of like, here's how your OCD works, and the anxiety goes up and then the compulsion brings it down, and instead we need to get on this habituation curve over here and really feel the anxiety. It's a very cool thing that people often come back and have kind of those early aha moments of, oh, I got it this time. And there was this very silly thing that I caught myself on and I didn't do it. Is that okay? And I'm always like, yes, that's amazing. You expanded upon this idea that we've been talking about and you're beginning to manage your own compulsions. And that's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Other than where it possibly could start, and we talked a little bit about can it stop? We know that these are gray areas. What are some of the definitive, positive, let's say, outcomes for OCD that people might need to hear? They're listening to this, they say, man, shit, I'm struggling with this. What do I have to look forward to? What are some of like the definitive takeaways, other than knowing that this is long-term work and there's going to be a lot of gray area?
Sure.
What could they expect to take away from ERP as a definitive positive outcome?
There are certainly people that will disagree with me when I say this, and they'll disagree with me because they're wrong and they're not as smart as I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
how dare them?
OCD is curable. It's absolutely curable. And there are lots of resources that, for good reasons, will point out that this is a chronic condition. You'll never be free of this. And if you want to get really technical, that's probably true in a way that we don't fully understand because we can't map an entire brain. There's something in there, genetically, obviously, but there's absolutely a maintenance lifestyle that you can become so good at maintaining that you don't notice it anymore. And if that's not cured, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
It can absolutely be cured. And a lot of the literature will point towards seeking some kind of functionality in your disorder, and instead you can have freedom. If freedom is the goal, you can have it.
Yeah.
And I shamelessly steal that from Dr. John Grayson. Shout out, not an ad, just a fan. Freedom over functioning, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I like that too, because I think there is a distinction that I've always seen as to why I've worked with addictions for 13 years, yet I'm sitting here as you're describing it, making just kind of a little connection in my week here. There's a difference, I think, between the types of obsessions or compulsions that don't find cures. Alcohol being one of them. But our thought process, I 100% agree. You can become so good at your ability to flow with your thought process and regulate yourself while still having the thought.
Yeah.
Right? Or else none of us would have thoughts and none of it would work and we would all just be in here all the time.
Yep.
It's like if someone else can be at peace with the flow of thoughts and we can also teach what that is, then of course someone can have freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely.
And OCD is kind of wild in that you can have freedom, you can be cured, And it can also be so intense and debilitating that it will rob you of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think about like those who have obsessions around conspiracies, destroys their whole family and gets them isolated nice and good. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we've touched on, OCD can take on almost anything. And so it's confusing to be experiencing something that's not in the mainstream view of OCD, but relationship OCD is absolutely a thing. Obsessive worry that maybe I was inappropriate with someone, I inadvertently or forgot that I had cheated on a partner. That's all OCD. Sexual orientation OCD is a sticky one because politically you get all into some different stuff, but people get worried that maybe I'm gay. Maybe I'm secretly gay and nobody knows. Maybe I don't even know. Maybe I'll find out in 20 years and have wasted my life in a heteronormative relationship.
Yeah. I have to break it to my kids and
Yeah. And so with that worry, why would you not do some compulsions to try and figure that out? Either definitely yes or definitely no.
Right.
At least I'll know.
Yeah.
And almost anything. Harm OCD is one that can be hard to talk about, especially the prevalence of harm OCD towards kids or towards my own kids. Like you mentioned, that's a very common intrusive thought that we never talk about.
It's fascinating to me because it's rare that I meet someone that hasn't had a thought like that, but you never hear it
You
ever.
never talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's almost a party trick for me and talking to people that, I had this thought and that was so terrible and I'm a horrible person. And I go, no, that's actually so common. I just call it spike the baby. Everybody's had it.
Yeah.
Everybody had a baby and went, I could just, and spike the baby. Because this is kind of an odd scenario that we're sometimes presented with of just, here's a baby all of a sudden, and I've never held a baby before. I've got this child that's either mine or like my niece or nephew, and now my brain's doing all these calculations of danger, and of course that intrusive thought comes up. Dropping this would be cataclysmic.
Yeah.
And so we play it out in our head, and for those of us lucky enough to not struggle with OCD, it's a thought that we go, didn't like that, and then move on.
Yeah.
But if the obsession is so powerful that it feels like it's actively happening, that's OCD.
It's a good distinction. Yeah. I mean, kids will bounce anyway. They're pretty. You could do a touchdown dance around it. It'll be all right.
They're pretty tough.
Yeah. These are good breakdowns. You know, we do have a lot of viewers that relate to the topic of OCD. I think you shed a lot of really good light. And if there was anything I was going to hear from it tonight before I turn it over for last thoughts for you is don't be afraid to, in the right circles with the right people, talk about whatever the obsession or compulsion is, especially if it's stealing your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any last thoughts that you would add on that or anything else and things that you would impart to our audience here?
I mean, if one person sees this or is tuning in and can hear that if you are experiencing OCD, you're not broken and you're not evil and God doesn't hate you, it's OCD. That's what that is. And while that is a miserable, confusing experience, we know exactly how to help with that. And there's no shame and no judgment. If you've been working with a therapist that it feels like it hasn't been going very well, that's okay. Yeah. There's absolutely well-trained ERP therapists all over the country, especially if you want to go to nocd.com. We're everywhere.
Yeah. Let's, we'll make sure we put that link as well, nocd.com, when we post the YouTube video, so that individuals can find that proper treatment. And just as a therapist who isn't trained in it, it's no hard feelings. I've had OCD clients where it's not the right fit. Yeah. I'm not the guy. You know, I'm a long-term process-oriented therapist. Sure. I am not your dude if you're looking to do exposure therapy.
Oh, man, I spent so long in eating disorders. And looking back, knowing what I know now, I'm like, there like a couple of dozen that I go, oh my God, that was so obviously OCD.
Yeah.
Now I know.
Right.
Back then, I didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah.
Didn't even know.
especially early in the career. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
That's happened a lot with addictions for me too. Of like, oh crap, I
yeah,
missed a lot.
especially when there's a little bit of transference going on with ourself, and when somebody's talking about something kind of activating for me, like I'm worried about all of this harm kind of stuff, then you kind of go, ooh, I don't know, that's outside of my wheelhouse. It's hard to kind of navigate that when it's not a thing that you're trained in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank God there are people who are trained in it, and especially in today's day and age. And we'll wrap on this. Whatever you're struggling with out there, there are people that are trained to help you. And if you're struggling to find them, just scroll through this channel, because we bring people on week after week who specialize in all the things you could possibly imagine. So thank you again for joining us here and sharing your expertise with our listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Luke Snear, licensed professional counselor. We will be back next week. We break the cycle here every Friday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. We love you. Take care.